Hello, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we're doing watercolor pumpkins. This is really easy and simple and perfect for October or autumn and Halloween. So grab your supplies. I've got my paints, my brushes, paper, 2 jars of water, and I'm using a round brush. This is my go-to. And then if you want a pencil to do your sketching first, you can always have that. I'll do one with a pencil sketch just to show the shape of the pumpkin. And then the second one I will do without. So you can kind of follow along whichever way you would like. All right, so I'm starting with that thin line, just a little pencil sketch for the ground where the grass might be growing. And then with pumpkins, they're in sections. So there's a main middle section, and then you can make these curved C-shaped lines on both the left and the right side. I'm trying to draw a little bit darker than I would normally on watercolor paper, but the harder you push down on your pencil, the harder it will be to erase later. So use a light sketch. And then add in a little top for where the vine part grows. Sometimes it's easier to see the final outcome so you know where you're headed with your paint and your drawing your subject. So if you want to watch this through once and then go to painting, that might be a little bit easier, especially if you've never painted pumpkins before. I'm starting with a really light orangey yellow. And then while that middle section is wet, I'm dropping in darker saturation of that orange. So you'll see that where I touch that wet area on the middle to the wetter area on the left side, wherever it touches, it will naturally bleed and blend that color. And then same thing on the right hand side for that section. I'm using some light washes first, and then I'll go back in with a darker paint color and drop it in just along the edges and kind of let that wet on wet technique work its magic on its own. So my pumpkin is a little smaller than my pencil sketch, so I'll go back and erase some of those lines after this first layer dries. And then if you want to paint in some of those back pieces that are peeking through next to that stem, you can put little tops of that orange shape just along the back. If you ever get too much paint and water, you can always keep a paper towel or a rag on hand and then soak up that extra water and paint. As watercolor dries, it tends to dry a little bit lighter. So I'm going back in with some lighter yellows just along the middle sections for each of these 3 pieces. All right, so for my second pumpkin, I'm going to eyeball it this time, no pencil sketch. So if you feel brave, go ahead and try this. I'm putting in that centerpiece first and then the side sections second. And it's the same technique. You're going to put in a little bit of a narrower shape along the 2 sides of that middle section. The great thing about watercolor is that you can change up the edges and that shape pretty easily with your paint still wet. So if that's looking too narrow, you can always add more paint and round out your shapes. As long as it's wet, you can manipulate it pretty easily. Once it dries, it's a lot harder. Remember, you can rotate your paper if it's easier to get a certain angle. So because I'm right-handed, I think some curves are a little bit easier when I flip the paper around. All right, so going with a darker brownish color, and you can put in that stem. I probably should have waited a little bit longer because my paint is still wet, so you can see that color just blending right in, which is fine. You can always use a dry, clean brush that's damp and then soak it up too. With your brush being almost like a sponge, you can pick it up and then dab it on your towel. We're going to let that dry. And you can tell when your layer has dried, it'll feel cool to the touch if it's still wet. But when it's fully dry, you won't feel that coolness. So now that it is dry, I can erase any extra pencil lines. And then we can work on our second layer. All right, so rinsing my brush and getting a nice green. We can put in the ground. I'm using really thin, light, sketchy marks. And then I'm rinsing my brush. And then just pulling out some color. So with just a clean brush and just water, I'm kind of extending that color by pulling it out into the clear area. And then while it's still damp, using the end of the brush to just flick out little grass blades. You can just indicate a few or you can do a lot. That's up to you. And also sometimes you'll see tiny leaves or vines coming off the stems of the pumpkins. So I'm putting in a few swirly lines and just indicating a few small little leaves. I'm still going pretty light where I put in the leaves and vines, and then you can always go in with darker layers and add in some extra contrast on your next layer. And then darkening up those stems with a little bit of brown and green. And if you want to pull in those vines and leaves along the bottom where the grass is, you can do that as well. I also have a video on my channel for watercolor bats. This is also great for wet-on-wet technique and a really easy, fun one to do with Halloween coming up. So look for that on my channel too. All right, so go ahead and add in any final details, and then we can actually rinse our brush. And then if you want to add in any other contrast or color or saturation, shadows, you can put in that darker color just like we did earlier along the edges and maybe the bottom where there would be a natural shadow. And then you can rinse your brush and blend out those edges by just using a clean wet brush and then softening out the edges. Keep your towel on hand so you can dab any extra color or paint on that towel. The benefit to working in layers and just going slowly is that you can make adjustments a little bit easier in watercolor. Once you put in a darker color, it's harder to go lighter. So it's always easier to go light to dark and build up in layers each of your contrast or saturation layers. All right, so add in any final touches, boost up your oranges and your yellows and browns wherever you would like. And let me know in the comments how you did and if you followed along and what other autumn or Halloween elements you'd like to paint. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you had a ton of fun painting. And remember to check out the description for any course info and other freebies. I have everything listed in the description box. See you next time.